So there was a couple that drove down a country road for several miles, not saying a word. And an earlier discussion had led to an argument, and neither of them wanted to concede their position. As they passed a barnyard of mules, goats, and pigs, the husband asked sarcastically, "Relatives of yours?" "Yep," the wife replied, "in-laws." This is exactly the kind of conversation that we're going to talk about not happening on a frequent basis. So here we are in the midst of the season for peace and nonviolence, and it just felt like a good time for us to delve into this powerful work by Marshall Rosenberg, Nonviolent Communication, a Language of Life. It was a class that I took in ministerial school. It was a week intensive, and boy, did it ever turn us inside out. Because it seems that when we start to look at how we communicate, especially when we're in conflict, wow, does it ever reveal what's hiding in there? And so I wanted to do a talk series on this. So we'll be talking about this throughout March and maybe continuing just to see how we're doing with it. But I wanted to start out by talking about Arun Gandhi, who was Mohandas Gandhi's grandson, because that's how the book begins. And it talks about Arun's childhood growing up in South Africa during apartheid in the 1940s. And what was happening to him was he was ridiculed and beaten daily by black youths who thought he was too white, and white youths who thought he was too black. It was debilitating and humiliating for him, and this humiliation started to turn into a rage. He was so frustrated. So at the age of 13, Arun's parents said, "You need to go spend some time with your grandfather, Mohandas Gandhi." So they sent him to India to spend time with his grandfather, Mohandas Gandhi, who we know was Mahatma Gandhi, to learn how to deal with his feelings, the anger and the frustration. And he ended up staying with his grandfather for 18 months. And he learned so much from him. He learned during that time a deeper understanding of violence and how it shows up in each of us. We're all violent. And he learned about that. And a major obstacle to healing is that we don't recognize that we're violent. We don't really want to admit that we're violent because we think about it in the context of war. You know, that's not us on a day-to-day basis. So how is it that we are violent? So Gandhi had his grandson, Arun, do an experiment to illustrate the point. So he had him draw a family tree of violence using the analogy of a genealogical tree. And so Gandhi told him that he would have a deeper appreciation of nonviolence once he could understand and acknowledge the violence that exists in the world overall. So Arun's assignment was to observe all of his daily life activities, all that he experienced, all that he read, all that he saw and did with and to others. And at the end of each day, he was to categorize them on the tree under physical violence or passive violence. I think we know what physical violence is, but passive violence is the violence that generates hurt, that is more emotional, that is more underlying. And it shows up in our world as bullying, as gossiping. You know, when we go out in the parking lot and we triangle and we don't go directly to people if we have something that has upset us. Ignoring teasing, prejudice, labels, judgments, our body language, our facial expressions, passive behavior such as, covert control, manipulation, silent treatment. So Arun noticed these ways of expression and wrote them all down, and his grandfather taught him that passive violence is what ignites physical violence. It fuels the fire of unhealed anger that then goes on to fuel physical violence. And we just don't want to admit to ourselves that we're violent, but we must, according to Gandhi. Unless we become the change we want to see in the world, no change is going to take place. And so often, we expect the other person to change first, don't we? Yeah. But nonviolence is strength. It's the way of love, and it's what Gandhi referred to as our natural state of compassion when violence has subsided from the heart. It's a way of being in the world that calls forth our compassion and our love. Because we know that peace can never be accomplished through fear. It can only unfold through love, through giving from our heart. And so Arun Gandhi said it this way. He said, nonviolence means allowing the positive within you to emerge, to be dominated by love, respect, understanding, appreciation, compassion, and concern for others, rather than having self-centered, selfish, greedy, hateful, prejudiced, suspicious, and aggressive attitudes that usually dominate our thinking. He said the world is what it is because we've made it that way. If it's ruthless, it's because we have made it ruthless by our attitudes. If we change ourselves, we can change the world. And changing ourselves begins with changing our language and how we communicate. Yeah, so Marshall Rosenberg talked about how compassion is our nature. And we talk about that in unity because we're inherently divine. And compassion is an expression of the divine love that we are. And it's really our nature to give compassion and love. So, how have we lost our way? Marshall Rosenberg talks about how we communicate, which is defined by speaking and listening. And this especially comes into play when we're in conflict. So nonviolent communication is how we speak and listen from a place of connection versus separation. It allows the love that we are to inherently flow. But boy, isn't it tough when we're in conflict? You know, when we need to have a difficult conversation with someone, we feel defensive, someone's hurt us, and we want to heal it. We want to still be in relationship, but how do we communicate? How do we bridge that gap of separation that we're feeling? We have to move out of those passive ways that we've learned to protect ourselves. Can any of us relate to how we self-protect? I love that about the silent treatment. My family was masterful of the silent treatment. I knew I was in trouble. Or when I heard, Sheryl Ann, get in here. Now, we weren't exactly taught how in school to communicate with each other when we were in conflict, much less express our feelings. So what nonviolent communication does, it's broken up into 4 components, and we'll talk about this. The first component of nonviolent communication is, so let's say I'm in conflict with you. The first step is that I would come to you and I would express what happened without interpretation. You know how sometimes we use those words like, oh, you always do this. Or I've talked to you 1,000,000 times about that. Is that accurate? Is that fact? Yeah. What nonviolent communication has us do is to get to what's really happening so we can communicate, so someone can really communicate. This is what you're upset about. And then the second step, and we're going to talk about this more, it's really a skill to cultivate, is how are you feeling? How do you feel about what happened? You know, we also don't have a dictionary of what feelings are. I feel like you just left me. That's not a feeling. I feel hurt. I feel frustrated. So nonviolent communication has us learn how to authentically express our feelings. It has us be mindful of how we're feeling so that we can communicate it to another person. So that nonviolent communication is about getting our needs met. And the third component of nonviolent communication is expressing our needs. Wow, that's vulnerable. It's all about getting our needs met. And the fourth is, now I have a request of you. So these are the steps, and how we go about it is what we're going to be learning and talking about. And one key component is how we listen. And so I really recommend that you take Edie's class on listening, because it's a skill and it's an art to be able to really listen to each other with an open heart, with the intention of, I want to create harmony with you. I might be angry with you, we might be in conflict, but how can we bridge that gap from where we are to where we want to be? And that is nonviolent communication. And when we do that, it brings joy. It brings connection. It brings authenticity and vulnerability. And folks, and I know I say this a lot, but when we look out in our world, how we communicate with each other on Facebook, I just invite you this week to start looking at how we communicate with each other. Is it nonviolent? No. Yeah, because we want to be right. You know, so the world is calling us to approach our communication with each other in a different way. And another thing that I'll say that I'm passionate about is in spiritual community. Because one thing that can hurt a spiritual community is when a community gossips or when people aren't communicating directly with each other. And so a healthy spiritual community is a community that can communicate with each other from love, from the compassion in our hearts. So, how you doing? Are you ready to take this journey of learning how to communicate nonviolently with each other? Because I tell you, it does wonders in partnerships and marriages, with parents and children, in our workplace. It's an amazing tool. All right, so this week I'm just going to invite you to start noticing communication, how you communicate, how people communicate with you. Notice it on social media. Notice, is that passive violence? Is that loving? Is that compassionate? And then I invite you to sign up for Edie's class. She's awesome. So let's affirm together. I give from my heart. I am the change I wish to see in the world as I communicate nonviolently. Bless you.